The views expressed and the opinions given by the individual host and their guests do not necessarily reflect those of Para X, its affiliates, or its sponsors.
It's coming.
All these voices. All these voices. All these things you can't explain. All these painful memories. They keep haunting you and daunting me. It's just a ghost of you and me. It's just a smoking gasoline. It's just a ghost of you and me. Of you and me. All these whispers.
My name is James Hershey. Right back.
All these shadows in my mind. My reflection I can't find. It's just a ghost of you and me. It's just a smoking gasoline. It's just a
That ought
ghost
to do
of
it.
you and me. Of you and me. Don't let 'em take you away. Don't let 'em bring you down inside. It's just the mirrors in your mind. Don't let 'em bring you down.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Staring into the Abyss. I am your host, horror author James Hershey Jr., and with me, as always, my co-host, old boy James Ash. How you doing, brother?
Pretty good. How's everybody tonight?
Tonight's episode is going to be a little bit different. Usually on Staring, we talk about the paranormal, we talk about ancient mysteries, things that go bump in the night, those kind of things that scare you. On tonight's episode, we are going to talk about one of my absolute favorite, and I believe one of Old Boy's absolute favorite figures in history. And he comes from the Wild West, and it is Billy the Kid. And in a way, you have a little bit of mystery with this one as well. So it's not just a strictly history show, because there's doubt on whether he died or didn't die, and we'll get into that on the show. So without further ado, this is going to be the life of Billy the Kid. There's not a whole lot known about Billy the Kid's early life. We know that he was born around 1870 to Catherine McCarty. She was a widow. Billy's actual father had died. He had a brother, and they went to Kansas with her longtime boyfriend, William Antrim. And she had a laundry service, and then she also bought and sold town lots to make some cash. She was doing pretty good, supporting herself and her kids, and then tragedy struck. And it's kind of a good parallel to nowadays as well, because that happens to people now, where you're doing really well in life, you've got a decent career, you're making some cash, you're raising your kids, things are going along wonderfully, and then all of a sudden something happens. In her case, it was she went to the doctor because she wasn't doing too well, doing a lot of coughing, stuff like that, and she got diagnosed with tuberculosis. And at that time, they didn't have a lot of the advanced medical treatments that they have now. When they got that back then, what the doctors would do is they would have them move to a warmer climate. That was the cure that they had for tuberculosis. Now, it didn't actually cure it. It just made you able to actually breathe a little bit better and made life somewhat tolerable so that you could, have a decent rest of your life until you died from it. Little side fact, Doc Holliday also had tuberculosis, and that's why he went out west and met up with Wyatt Earp and everything, was because his doctors had urged him to move west to a warmer climate to help with his. So that's what happened to her. She got tuberculosis, and the doctor sent her out. She loaded up her family, and her boyfriend went with her, and they headed west to Colorado. And then from Colorado, they went south down to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And Catherine and her boyfriend, William Antrim, got married on March 1st, 1873. It was in a Presbyterian church, and after the wedding, the family headed south again, down to Silver City in Grant County. what she was hoping was that the warmer climate would benefit the health, and there was an opportunity in the mining industry for her husband because he was a prospector. And back then there was a lot of gold being found in the area, so they hoped that by moving down there he would have a chance to make some money because she couldn't do a whole lot anymore because of her health. In early April, they arrived in Silver City and they got themselves a little cabin, and Mr. Atram found work as a carpenter and a butcher, but he spent almost all of his time that he wasn't working at one of those two jobs out prospecting and trying to make a lot of money, find gold and do well. And he also had a little bit of a gambling problem, and he spent a lot of his time that he wasn't prospecting or working gambling and wasting all the money that he made, basically, or at least a good portion of it. To make up the difference, his mother took in boarders in their little bitty cabin. And she also had a bakery of sorts because she sold homemade pies and sweet cakes and stuff like that to try to make ends meet and to make up some of the money that her husband had lost gambling. The boys did what boys normally do. They ran around with other kids in the town, and they got into little bitty things, little harmless mischief and shenanigans. And then of course once school started, they went to school like other kids. Most of the residents and the other children in Silver City, they knew Billy the Kid when he was that age, when he was little. And they all have fond memories of Billy the Kid. They said that he was a good kid. He wasn't a criminal. He wasn't a horrible monster like you would imagine that they would be. A couple of them actually, history has recorded what they said about Billy the Kid. Chauncey Truesdale said that Henry was only a small boy, small for his age and kind of skinny. Louis Abram, who was a schoolmate and a friend of Billy the Kid's, said that he was just an ordinary boy. I don't remember him doing anything bad. He was just a little mischievous. Everybody that knew him denied the story, because there was a story that went around that when he was a little kid, he killed a man that had insulted his mother. It's like one of the legends of Billy the Kid. And all the people that actually knew him when he was that age and were classmates of his and knew his family, all of them said that story is absolutely untrue, that there's no truth at all to it. And I checked, and there's no newspaper records or no legal records during that time period of any incident with Billy the Kid killing anybody. So I would be pretty confident in saying that story is not true at all. I mean, I guess there's always a chance, but probably not. When Billy the Kid was little, much like when he was an adult, he was a tiny little guy. He was skinny, he had really small hands, and he was kind of, I don't know how to say this diplomatically, he was kind of girlish looking. He was not a manly looking man. And he was the target, and a perfect target really, for bullies and the teasing and the picking on, that kids do. But what he lacked in size, he more than made up for in courage and a really quick wit. He was a really bright kid. And he had a wonderful sense of humor. He would always be joking and laughing. And that was one of the ways that he dealt with a lot of the bullying. Because, kids are cruel. Everybody knows that, and everybody says that. And you can either become part of the joke and be a clown and have fun with it, like Billy did, or you can let it destroy you. Some other things about Billy the Kid at that age: he had a passion for music. He loved to sing. He loved to dance. And he was actually a very well-behaved student, which is shocking for a lot of people that hear that, because they think of Billy the Kid as an outlaw, as a gunslinger, as a bad guy. You know what I mean? They don't expect that he would be smart. They don't expect that he would love to sing and dance. They don't expect that he would be very well behaved. And another thing is he loved to read. He was a very bright kid and he liked to learn. He wasn't loud or obnoxious or a brat like some kids that he ran with were. They were kind of rambunctious, but he wasn't. He was really quiet and mild-mannered and well-behaved. He was easygoing, lighthearted fella. He was loyal, courteous, brave, and even people that didn't like him back then have said this about him, all those things. Louis Abrams said again about him that he was just an ordinary boy. So, that kind of sums it up. Nothing really that stood out about Billy the Kid at that age. Something would happen that would kind of turn his life upside down, and he would never be the same again. his mother's health was starting to deteriorate rapidly. They had hoped that by moving west into a warmer climate that it would help because that's what the doctors told her. But that's not the way it worked out at all for her. She ended up bedridden to where she had to stay in bed 24/7, couldn't get up and move around anymore, couldn't do things. To add on to that and to make things worse, her husband pretty much deserted the family. And he went and moved out into the hills full time to prospect to try to make, the big score and hit the mother lode. On September 16th in 1874, Catherine Atram died. When her husband finally returned, he took the boys and he moved in with the Knight family. The boys kept going to school like usual, and their stepfather would just come and go without any real rhyme or reason to it. He wasn't there very often. So the Knights were pretty much raising the boys while he went and did his thing. Before too long, the boys ended up separated. They went like from foster family to foster family because the Knights weren't going to keep them. While this was going on, the stepfather, Bill Atram, he relocated to Arizona. And when he got to Arizona, he went to a judge and he relieved himself completely of any parental responsibility to Billy or his brother. And he basically just left them on their own to fend for themselves. I mean, at this time, they were, like I said, bouncing back and forth from foster family to foster family. And they were pretty much on their own. Because Billy was left to his own devices and left on his own with no one really to take care of him, he was understandably broke. And he was still young, and he wasn't a big guy. Like I said, he was a tiny little thing. So he really couldn't go out and get a normal job, baling hay or doing the things that people his age would do at that time period in order to make money. So that's when his life of crime actually began. That's when he started breaking the law. And his first offense was kind of a silly one. His first offense was stealing several pounds of butter from a rancher. And then he took the butter and he turned around and he sold it to the merchant at the store. And the county sheriff found out about this and went and saw the kid. And he didn't arrest him and he didn't throw him in jail or anything like that. He just really reamed his butt good, and he gave him a warning and let Billy the Kid go. About a year after his mother had died, Billy was living at Mrs. Brown's boarding house. And to try to earn money, this was like when he was around 13 or 14. To try to earn money, he washed dishes and he waited tables at the Star Hotel. And he became friends with a young man named George Schaefer. Now, he was also known, George Schaefer was, as Sombrero Jack. Sombrero Jack was a thief, a drunk, a gambler, and he was a really bad influence on Billy, and he pushed him along in his life of crime. At that time, Billy the Kid didn't have a lot of money. What little bit he made washing dishes and waiting tables, he used to feed himself and all that kind of stuff. So he looked poor. I mean, he was poor and he looked it. His clothes were all worn out and had holes in them and were dirty. And Sombrero Jack couldn't stand the way Billy the Kid looked, so he stole a bundle of laundry from a Chinese laundry and he gave it to Billy the Kid so that he would have clothes to wear. Well, Mrs. Brown found the bundle of clothes hidden in a trunk in Billy the Kid's room, and she actually reported him to the sheriff. Now, as you can imagine, the sheriff was not thrilled because he had already given Billy the Kid a warning before, and he was not thrilled that he broke the law again. So Billy was arrested and taken in, and he wanted to go live with his father in Arizona. So they arranged for him to be able to leave to go to Arizona. The sheriff agreed because Billy wouldn't be in the area anymore, so he wouldn't be the sheriff's problem. He'd be somebody else's problem, basically. So the Truesdells gave Billy the Kid money and put him on a stagecoach that was going to Arizona. And the plan was he was going to go there and he was going to live with his stepfather. But when he got there and he saw his stepfather, he told him what had happened. What the deal was and what he'd gotten in trouble for. And his stepfather basically, he looked at him and said, hey, if that's the kind of kid you are, get the hell out of here. I don't want nothing to do with you. So his stepdad kicked him out. So now Billy the Kid was in Arizona. and he was alone and homeless in the desert, basically, and had no one to help him. And it was a very, very hostile area, and it was dangerous for an adult to be on their own there. He was just a teenage boy. So basically, he wandered around, and he lived a hand-to-mouth existence, and he couldn't really find a lot of work because he was young, and he was tiny, and he couldn't really do the jobs that grown men did. So he met a guy named John Mackey, and he entered into a partnership with him. And John Mackey was another thief, and he was a huge influence on Billy the Kid's life. Like I said, they formed a partnership, and they started stealing saddles and horses. Mostly they stole the saddles and the horses from the army in the Camp Grant area. They were eventually caught, and they were thrown in jail at Camp Grant. Billy the Kid escaped the jail and took off. And a few months later, he came back. And this is kind of a pattern in Billy the Kid's life. And a lot of people say that it's what ended up causing his death, because he was really, really good at escaping and getting away, but the problem is he always came back. And it would drive people crazy because the lawmen didn't really want to hurt him or do anything to him, but he just wouldn't stay away. I mean, he would leave, get away, and then he'd come back to the area again and start doing bad stuff again and get caught again. So they just didn't know what to do with him. So he ended up getting into a little altercation, and he got bullied a whole lot. And this guy named Wendy threw him down on the ground, and he sat on him and pinned his arms down with his knees. Like, you know how you do that thing where somebody's on their back and you put your knees on their arms so that they can't move, and you sit on their chest? That's what this dude Wendy did to him. And he started slapping Billy in the face and taunting him and teasing him. Billy managed to get his right arm free, and he got a hold of his .45, and he shot the guy. And Wendy kind of, fell over, clutching his stomach, and because that's where Billy had shot him, was in the gut. And then Billy got up and ran out the door, jumped on the nearest horse, and took off. The horse that he jumped on happened to be a prize racehorse, but Billy didn't keep the horse. He found another horse, and then he sent that horse back because he knew that it was a valuable horse, and he didn't want to get in a lot of trouble for that. He was already in trouble for murder, because even though that guy Wendy Cahill had been picking on him and abusing him and doing bad stuff all the time to him, and he was a lot bigger, and he was slapping Billy around and everything, they still ruled that shooting unjustifiable. So Billy had a murder rap on his head, and if he would have came back, he'd have been in a lot of trouble. So he took off back down to New Mexico, and he stopped and visited his friends, the Knights and the Truesdells, but he didn't stay with them. He just kept on going. Once again, he was all alone, and he was vulnerable. He headed to Dona Ana County near La Mesilla, where he joined one of the most notorious gang of rustlers and killers in the Southwest. The leader of that gang was Jesse Evans, and they called themselves the Boys. Jesse Evans was the captain of the gang, but it was John Kinney, who was known as the King of the Rustlers, who kind of ran things. He coordinated all the plans, basically, all the rustling activities. They stole cattle and horses, and they sold them to people that bought stolen goods. They wouldn't ask any questions. Basically like criminals do nowadays, where they take stuff to a fence. No one was really willing to do anything about it because they were afraid they would get killed, and nobody wanted to risk their lives to stop them. That included all the lawmen. But a guy named Colonel Albert Fountain, who was the editor of the Mesilla Valley Independent, he was writing about them all the time in the paper. And he started putting a lot of pressure on the law to do something about it, by writing article after article after article about it. The law finally got tired of the bad press, and they started cracking down on the gang. And that caused the gang to leave the area because they didn't want to get arrested. So they moved down towards Lincoln County, which is 150 miles northeast of Dona Ana County, where they were. And this begins the story of Billy the Kid, really, that most people know from the movie Young Guns and all that kind of stuff. That's kind of where it starts off, to where he gets into Lincoln County. After they got there, the gang became allies with the Murphy and Dolan Company. That was the people that pretty much ran the whole area. They were the most dominating force there. Tensions were building between the Murphy and Dolan Company and this guy named John Tunstall. That's the guy that Billy took up with in the movie that started the Lincoln County War. A lot of people think that the Lincoln County War was a range war, but it was a lot more than that because there was a lot of different feuds that had erupted, not only between them but all kinds of other parties since like the 1860s. But the bitter feud between John Tunstall and James Dolan was the most notorious, and it was definitely the most bloody. Tunstall was an Englishman and Dolan was an Irishman, and those two didn't get along anyway, and the fact that they were competing for the same cattle and the same land, that really kind of put it up over the top. Both Dolan and Tunstall had the exact same objective, and that was to form a monopoly in Lincoln County. Murphy and Dolan were already established there, and they had the Santa Fe ring. They owned the sheriff, and now they had the boys, which was Billy's gang that had come down, backing them up as well. In 1877, that was before the Dolan and Tunstall feud really broke out, Murphy became ill, and he ended up in a hospital in Santa Fe, and he eventually died of cancer a year later. Now, this fact kind of discredits the common belief that Murphy was the antagonist in the war against the Englishmen. See, a lot of people think that Murphy started all this, and Tunstall was just this innocent guy that was getting bullied and picked on, and that's simply not the way it actually happened. Because he was actually in the hospital bed dying during this time, you know? It was Murphy's protege, James Dolan, that took Murphy's place when he became ill and became head of that side. Dolan was a native of Ireland, and he did not tolerate anything getting in his way. He was one of those guys that did what he wanted to do, and if you got in his way, he would destroy you. Unfortunately for John Tunstall, he's the guy that got in the way. He was a cocky little newcomer who thought that he could get rich quick, and he thought that he was so much smarter than these old dumb cowboys in the West, and that he could simply outsmart them and win. He wrote his father, and he said, everything in New Mexico that pays at all is worked by a ring. There's an Indian ring, an army ring, the political ring, the legal ring, the Roman Catholic ring, the cattle ring, the horse thieves ring, and half a dozen other rings. It is necessary either to get into a ring or make one for yourself. I am at present at work making a ring. He went on to write, I propose to confine my operations to Lincoln County, but I intend to handle it in such a way as to get half of every dollar that is made in the county by anyone. So, as you can see by his own words that he wrote his father, Tunstall was not exactly a honest man that was just trying to start his own business in a corrupt town, and that he was just a victim of circumstance. Tunstall's problem was he was too greedy, because Dolan wanted to form a monopoly, and Tunstall wanted to form a monopoly, and basically it was just came down to who was going to outdo the other one and get there first. So basically, with his father's money and an attorney named Alex McSween as his partner, Tunstall started his own ranch, and he opened a town store, and kind of became a thorn in Dolan's side, and Dolan kind of noticed him. Tunstall knew that he was causing problems. You know, he knew that he was kind of shaking the proverbial hornet's nest because he built his store like a fort. Okay, it wasn't like a normal store. He built it like a fort, and he hired gunmen to be his ranch employees. You know, he didn't hire normal cowboys that could do the job. He hired heavies. You know what I mean? He hired people that knew how to fight and knew how to use a gun and were killers, basically. So that shows, in my mind at least, that he was definitely expecting trouble. But his downfall was that he believed that the law would protect him. So all he had to do was defend against the occasional thing that might happen, but he thought the law had his back because it was the law. But unfortunately for him, he just didn't understand, you know, until it was too late, that the Dolan and the Santa Fe ring kind of were the law because they owned the sheriff. So there would not be any lawman that would come riding to his rescue and crack down on the Dolans when they were trying to muscle him out. Dolan was having financial problems with the Murphy and Dolan Company. It was actually on the verge of going bankrupt. And that was the time when Tunstall moved in and started gaining support from the locals and from a local cattle baron, John Chisholm. And that created a huge threat to the already hurting Dolan Company. So that is another huge factor in this that caused the Dolan Company to go to such extreme measures. Because he was, like I said, he was already losing a lot of money, and it wasn't good. Dolan lashed out by getting McSween arrested, which was the lawyer, on trumped up embezzlement charges. And then he had Jesse Evans and the gang steal horses from Tunstall's ranch. And then Tunstall struck back at Dolan by exploiting the sheriff for his default in tax collecting in an editorial that he wrote in the independent newspaper. So basically he wrote a letter to the editor kind of deal where he exposed the sheriff as giving preferential treatment to some by not collecting taxes and collecting taxes on others. At that same time, the Boys, which was the gang that the kid was in, was getting a little bit too much for Billy the Kid. The stuff that was going on was stuff that he really didn't agree with. So he kind of went his own way, and he hooked up with some of the locals, like the Jones family and their two cousins, Frank and George Coe. And his relationship with Jesse Evans, who was running the Boys, was getting rocky. Some of the other members of the gang didn't care much for Billy the Kid either, and they didn't want him hanging out. In particular, the guy Bill Morton was one. He bullied the kid relentlessly, and he actually kicked him out of camp one evening because Billy the Kid was getting a little bit too friendly with Morton's girl. During that time, Billy the Kid was bouncing back and forth between the Boys and the Jones family. And then he was arrested and charged with the theft of the Tunstall horses that he went and did with the gang. And he ended up thrown in the town jail. To call it a jail was really kind, because it was really nothing more than just a hole in the ground. Tunstall knew that Billy the Kid was a member of Evans' gang, and he went and saw him. Instead of pressing charges against Billy the Kid, he offered him employment. So basically, we don't know whether he felt sorry for Billy the Kid because he was little, or if it was kind of a plan that he had to bring Billy the Kid onto his side to get all the information that he had, and maybe even use him as a witness against the rustlers in the future. Billy the Kid knew that he wasn't welcome anymore by the gang, and he really didn't have anywhere else to go, so he took Tunstall up on the offer and joined him. So they released him from jail, and he was hired on with Tunstall to work on the ranch. He was 17 at the time, and he hoped that this was going to be a brand new start for him. So to kind of symbolize that, he changed his name, and he started going by the name William H. Bonney. Now, everybody that knows anything about Billy the Kid knows that name, William H. Bonney. That's what he went by during that time. He was kind of a real outsider at this time. I mean, he didn't feel like he fit in anywhere. Ever since his mom died, he's bounced around. Nobody wanted him. He's always ended up kicked out and on his own. And he felt like he finally had a family again. He finally had found his place. They welcomed him with open arms, and he immediately became friends with the other guys that worked on the ranch. George Coe said he was the center of interest everywhere he went, and though heavily armed, he seemed as gentlemanly as college-bred youth. He quickly became acquainted with everyone, and because of his humorous and pleasing personality, grew to be a community favorite. George's cousin Frank also said he was about 17, 5'8", 138 pounds, and stood straight as an Indian. Fine-looking lad as I ever met. He was a ladies' man, and the Mexican girls were all crazy about him. He spoke their language well. He was a fine dancer, could go all their gates, and was one of them. He was a wonder. You would have been proud to know him. By that, you can tell that they really liked him a lot. Dolan was getting really frustrated during this time. He was doing everything he could think of to get rid of John Tunstall. He bad-mouthed him. He made multiple threats towards him. He tried to actually frame him, and he even pointed a gun in his face and threatened him. And he had the sheriff levy his property for McSween's debts, which McSween, remember, was the attorney. McSween had just been released from jail on bond, but he owed a lot, and he was trying to levy Tunstall's property for McSween's debts. But no matter what he did, Tunstall wasn't going anywhere. Tunstall knew his rights, and all that Dolan was doing was pissing him off and making him more determined to fight back and win. Had Tunstall just gave in and gone away, he would have been fine. But his stubbornness and the fact that he wouldn't leave ended up costing him dearly, and it cost everybody who he was associated with. On February 18th, 1878, Sheriff Brady sent his deputy, Bill Matthews, and a posse to Tunstall's ranch to attach cattle in the embezzlement case against McSween. Tunstall let him take the cattle, but Tunstall wouldn't let him take the horses. So Tunstall got a handful of his men, and he herded the horses to Lincoln. Upon arriving at Tunstall's ranch, the deputy, he had a smaller posse led by Bill Morton that was going to go after the horses and Tunstall. And Jesse Evans was part of that. Tom Hill, Frank Baker, George Henman, people from that gang were all members of that posse. About half of the people in the posse were members of the boys' gang and were all wanted outlaws. And that's kind of funny because they were riding with the law and making up a legal posse. Tunstall's group rode towards a canyon. Billy the Kid and John Middleton rode drag, which was about 300 yards behind. They were pushing the horses forward, while Tunstall, Brewer, and Rob Winneman led the way. The attention was kind of diverted by a flock of wild turkeys, and they pulled out their rifles and they took off after the turkeys because they wanted to shoot a couple, for dinner. And they were the ones that were actually supposed to be guarding Tunstall. So when they went after the turkeys, Tunstall was left all alone. Billy the Kid saw that posse start galloping forwards towards Tunstall, and he spurred his horse on, trying to warn Brewer and Winneman that the posse was coming. Middleton rode towards Tunstall, and he screamed out, "For God's sakes, follow me." And as he and all the others headed for cover behind some rocks, John Tunstall got shot. And his last words were actually, "What? John, what?" Because he didn't hear what he said. And he got gunned down. The following day, Brewer and Billy the Kid swore out affidavits of justice to the Justice of the Peace, Wilson, who issued warrants for the assassin's arrest. Constable Martinez deputized Billy the Kid and Fred Waite to aid him in serving the warrants against the men. They were all down at Dolan's store. So Billy the Kid was actually deputized to do this. When they walked in, the sheriff was there, and he refused to allow Billy the Kid to arrest the men. And instead, he took the constable and the two deputies, one of which was Billy the Kid, prisoner. They confiscated their weapons. Now remember that Billy the Kid had been legally deputized, but they confiscated their weapons, and they took a Winchester rifle that Tunstall had given Billy the Kid, which really upset Billy the Kid. And they took their guns and they cursed him and they abused him, slapped him around and everything. And after a couple hours, they let Martinez go. And then 2 days later, they let Billy the Kid and Fred Waite go. But the fact that they were held for 2 days made them miss Tunstall's funeral. The story that a lot of people tell about Billy the Kid swearing revenge when he was at the funeral over Tunstall's grave and swearing he's going to get revenge, that's a myth because it couldn't have happened because Billy the Kid was locked up. Wilson then deputized Brewer, who formed his own posse called the Regulators. Now that is what you saw in the Young Guns movie, was the Regulators. That's what this is. One of the first members he recruited to the Regulators was Billy the Kid, who was a very dependable soldier. He was loyal, and he could fight his ass off. He was a really good fighter. They were frustrated by the sheriff interfering, and the governor wouldn't listen to him at all. I mean, he didn't care what was going on in the county. He just pretended like nothing was going on. So even though the Regulators were deputized, they couldn't do things the legal way, and they had to kind of think outside of the box. The first people that they killed was Bill Morton and Frank Baker. A lot of people say that they were killed execution style. They actually surrendered to the Regulators, and they killed them anyway, because they believed that if they turned the prisoners over to the sheriff would just release them. During the killing, they also shot William McCloskey, who was on friendly terms and very sympathetic towards Morton and Baker, and was probably a spy. Then the 6 Regulators, including Billy the Kid, ambushed and killed the sheriff and his deputy, George Henman. The Kid later confessed to Mrs. McSween that he was aiming at Deputy Bill Matthews and missed and hit the other guy. Matthews actually escaped the shooting. Billy the Kid felt that Matthews was the most responsible for Tunstall's death, because he's the one that sent the sub posse to go after him. And he knew that what was going to happen when he sent them. Because the reason Billy thought that was because he filled the posse with outlaws and killers, basically. So he knew what was coming, and he sent him out after him. And so that's why he wanted to kill Matthews so bad. But Matthews ended up getting the last laugh, because when Billy the Kid stepped out in the street to reclaim his rifle, which was laying next to Brady's corpse, Matthews shot the kid. Now the bullet only clipped his hip, but he did shoot him. Soon after that, they went after another one of Dolan's gunmen, Buckshot Roberts. Now, that is the scene in the Young Guns movie where they go and the guy is like just such a badass, and they're debating on who wants to go after him. That's Buckshot Roberts. They ended up killing Buckshot, but he killed Dick Brewer and wounded 2 other guys. Billy the Kid was grazed in the arm by a bullet in that battle. Now, Charlie Bowdry gave Roberts his fatal wound, but everybody blamed Billy the Kid for it, even though it was actually Charlie that had shot Buckshot. Dolan retaliated. He got Colonel Dudley and the Army at Fort Stanton to come. And the Kid and several regulators, along with Alex McSween, the lawyer, were trapped and surrounded in McSween's home in Lincoln. That's the scene in the movie where the Army is surrounding the house and they end up burning it out. The siege lasted longer than the movie tells it lasted. It was actually 5 days long, and they couldn't get Billy to come out, or anybody, any of them to come out, and they couldn't come in because every time they tried to make a move towards the home, Billy and the guys in there started shooting at them. So they ended up just setting the house on fire. Pretty much everybody started to panic. This is where Billy the Kid really stepped into his own and took leadership. The plan was that him and 4 other guys were going to make a break out the back door and run towards Tunstall's store through the gate on the east side of the yard. And they were going to draw all the fire to them. And while they were doing that, McSween and the others were going to run to the rear wall through the back gate and go down by the river and get away. They waited till about 9 o'clock at night to make their move. That way they would have darkness. The problem was, because the house was on fire, it kind of lit everything up for a short distance, and they didn't really have the cover of darkness. Billy led a group towards Tunstall's store just like they had planned, but as soon as they left the store, they were met by a lot of gunfire. So basically they made a quick dash for the river to meet with the others. Meanwhile, McSween and his group ran for their lives towards the back gate, and they also got shot at. Basically it was pure pandemonium. Guns were blazing from all around, men were falling dead here and there, wounded. When the smoke cleared, it was all done. After the shooting, McSween and 4 other regulators were dead. On Dolan's side, they lost a guy named Robert Beckwith. That death was pinned on Billy the Kid, even though he wasn't even close to the guy, and he was running actually in the complete opposite direction. So there's really no way he killed him, but they blamed him for it. Following the battle, the victors were the Army guys. They got drunk and they looted Tunstall's store, while Billy the Kid and the rest of the survivors kind of just slipped away into the darkness. Billy had hoped that by joining Tunstall that he was going to be turning over a new leaf, having a better future. But it actually ended up the exact opposite. Basically, the only future he had now was to be hunted. And it was sad, because out of everyone who fought in the Lincoln County War, Billy the Kid was really the only guy that was punished. I mean, for the rest of his life, he was a wanted man. He went here and there trying to avoid, everybody that was chasing him. They went up into the hills on foot. They ended up stealing horses, and they went to San Patricio, which was a small Mexican village that was like 14 miles south of Lincoln. Laid low there for about 2 weeks, and then they rode to the Apache reservation near Blazer's Mill. Besides themselves, they also had 3 Mexicans with them, and one of the Mexicans was a former constable whose name was Martinez. While Billy the Kid and the regulators headed to the spring to water their horses, the Mexicans kept on going on down the road toward the agency. The Mexicans encountered some Indians who thought that the Mexicans were there to steal their horses, so they started shooting at them. Indian agent Fred Godfrey and his clerk Morris Bernstein heard the shooting. Bernstein mounted on his horse and rode down there. Martinez would later say that Bernstein shot at him, and that in self-defense he shot back at Bernstein and killed him. Meanwhile, while that was going on at the spring, Billy the Kid and the others had gotten off their horses to water them, and gunfire broke out there. Billy the Kid's horse reared up and ran away, leaving Billy the Kid without a horse to ride. George Coe pulled the kid up on his horse behind him, and they took off. They took advantage of all the commotion and used that opportunity to go to the corral and get Billy the Kid a new horse, which he stole, and then they opened up the gate, and then they took off, and all the horses ran out. Martinez later turned himself in and admitted to killing Bernstein in self-defense. Billy the Kid would be blamed for a lot of the death that happened that day, and he never even fired a single shot. And that kind of became the pattern in his life. A lot of times these things would break out, and Billy didn't really kill anybody, but for whatever reason, he always got the blame, and it ended up being this giant reputation that he built, that he was this killer and this badass. And even though he was a badass, I mean, he could fight, but he didn't kill all the people that they said he killed. Things in Lincoln were getting a lot worse. The residents were pleased that the governor was finally replaced by a new governor, who was a retired general named Lew Wallace. But even though there was a new governor, all hell was still breaking loose in Lincoln. John Selman formed a ruthless gang called the Rustlers, which basically it was all the most dangerous bad guys in the territory. Most of the gang, the Rustlers, was actually the former members of the Boys. The Rustlers went on a rampage, raiding and burning down ranches, killing people, gang raping women, shooting young Mexican boys just for fun. Somebody asked them one time who they were, and they yelled out, "We are devils, just come from hell." It was way worse than anything Billy ever did. But history doesn't really remember the Rustlers. They remember Billy the Kid as being the terrorist of New Mexico, when in reality all he did was go after the people that killed Tunstall, and he was deputized to do so. All this ended up coming to a head when Pat Garrett, who was a guy that Billy had once ran with, became sheriff. And he gave Billy multiple chances to run away. He actually spoke with Billy, and he told Billy, just leave. You know, I don't want to kill you, but they're forcing me to come after you. So just leave. Billy wouldn't do it. We all remember that famous scene in Young Guns where Billy is arrested and he's in jail, and he says that he has to go to the bathroom, and one of his friends had left a pistol in the outhouse for him, and he got the pistol and he went back in, and when he was walking up the stairs, he turned around and pulled the gun. I'm sure all of you remember that scene, and he shot the guy dead, and then he escaped and rode off. Billy was famous for those kind of escapes. Every time he would end up in a scrape where he would get arrested or busted or end up in a situation where everybody thought he was dead for sure, he would always escape. He found a way out all the time. He found a way out from the house when it was on fire, you know, that I spoke about earlier. Billy had a knack of always getting away. Pat Garrett wanted him to get away now. He wanted him to leave. He didn't want to arrest Billy because he knew Billy would be hung. But like always, Billy just kept coming back. So according to history, Garrett formed a posse and they went after Billy the Kid. Throughout this time, he gave Billy the Kid multiple opportunities to escape, but Billy never would actually run out of state and get away. He would always come back. So according to the history, Pat Garrett found Billy the Kid, and he shot him at night when he was in bed with his woman, when Billy didn't even have his gun. Shot him in the back, according to history. That's what history says happened. Now, there was a gentleman named Brushy Bill Roberts who claimed to be Billy the Kid. He went to the governor of New Mexico. Brushy Bill Roberts went to him and he said, "I am Billy the Kid." He said, I didn't die. Me and Pat Garrett faked my death, and I ran away. And I hid out of state, and I'm back, and I want my pardon that I was promised by the governor. Because the governor had promised Billy the Kid a pardon if he turned himself in. And the governor went back on his word. That's why Billy had escaped and got away. Because he wasn't going to be hung, you know, when he was promised a pardon. So he got away. But he came back wanting that pardon. And the interesting thing about this is that he had a lot of scars on his body. You know, he had the scar on his arm from when he got shot. He got the scar on his hip from where the bullet grazed him. So all of his scars matched up with the scars that Billy the Kid had. And all of the people that knew Billy the Kid that were still alive at the time had a chance to talk to Brushy Bill Roberts, and they've all put in sworn statements that Brushy Bill Roberts was actually Billy the Kid, that they had spoken to him, and that was actually Billy the Kid, that he had survived and was who he said he was. The governor refused to give him the pardon, and he refused to acknowledge that he was Billy the Kid. Brushy Bill Roberts ended up dying of natural causes, and he never did get that pardon that he was promised by the governor way back when he was younger. And he never did get acknowledged to be officially Billy the Kid.
This is one of my favorite outlaws of all time. This has always been an interesting story. Did Billy the Kid really get killed by Pat Garrett? Well, like James said earlier, that there was a guy that came out that he was Billy the Kid, he never died. Do I believe that story? Yes, I don't think Billy the Kid died. Because I think him and Pat Garrett were still best friends, and I think the reason why he never caught Billy in the first place is that I think they were in cahoots together. I think Billy got let go, and he went somewhere in Mexico and just disappeared. And then he came back when he was older, and like they said, and you guys saw Young Guns too. A guy came out and said he was Billy the Kid. Well, he lived up to everything he said. All the stuff came out to be true, but he died before he can ever prove it. I believe it was him. I don't believe he got killed. I think Billy the Kid was brilliant. He was very smart. He was a Mason. We never got to talk about how he was actually a Mason. People don't even realize that. He was a Mason. And I don't know too much about that. The reason I know that is my friend's a Mason. He told me about it. And I've read a little bit about it, but he was a Freemason. And I think Pat Garrett was a Freemason. I don't know for a fact on that. So don't take it to the bank with me. But I do not think he died. I think he was let go. I think that Pat Garrett wanted to make himself look famous, and it backfired anyway. He ended up still Billy Kid. He made Billy Kid become a martyr after he got killed. But, if you guys ever seen the Young Gun movies, with Emilio Estevez, I love those movies. And because I think he portrayed Billy the Kid, probably that's not how Billy really was, but he was crazy, but not as, how Hollywood blows everything out of proportion and makes him look like, he was like godlike in those movies. Those movies were my favorite Westerns. Those two, he was crazy in those movies. And I like that part where he says, "I'll make you famous." It's like one of the best parts I've seen ever in a movie. Those are my two favorite Westerns, though. He killed 21 people. Well, in the second one, it says he got accused of, he didn't kill all those people, but they accused him of it. It's a tragedy because he was such a young, I think he was a man, but he was young. And even if he didn't die, he had to hide for the rest of his life who he was. So in reality, I think maybe if he did, and there's a possibility he might have got killed. But maybe it was better off he got killed, because I don't know if I would want to be running around for 30, 40 years from the law, because some people didn't think he died. So he basically had to hide in Mexico, and then he finally, I think he came in Texas or New Mexico, and after 30 years or 40 years, whatever it was, and came out. He supposedly did. There's some people said that's not true, but I believe it was. This is a great story. This is one of my favorites. Like James, I know James loves Billy the Kid. Him and Jesse James are my favorite outlaws. Those are, and then Tombstone, Doc Holliday. I love that story. That movie too is awesome. But I like Wyatt Earp was cool. But outlaw wise, that's my favorite outlaws. It's just the way Billy killed people was just crazy. He was just a crazy guy. Imagine somebody in the 1800s doing stuff that you could never imagine now. I mean, there's people that do crazy stuff and gangs and stuff like this, but this guy was like a god in the 1900s. Even now, you say Billy the Kid, everybody knows who he is. People still talk to him over what's almost been 180 years since he's been dead, or 100 years because, that guy came out, whatever, but it's over 100 years. This is like the most popular of them all. You hear everybody talk about this guy. And like I said, they made the Young Guns movies. They even made movies about Billy the Kid back in every year, 60s, 70s, whatever. But this guy has always been like one of my favorites. He's one of those guys you were voting for, even though he was a bad guy, that you wanted to win. Even in the movies, he was the villain, but he was like the anti-hit villain. And I know he wasn't like that really. I mean, he was a killer. Let's not get that wrong. He killed people. 21. And I think it's a romantic story if you think about it. how Pat Garrett was going after him. He killed some of his, supposedly killed him. I don't think he did. I never will. I think Pat Garrett let him go. I think Pat Garrett really did love him as a brother. But, Pat Garrett, people trying to bribe him with money. But it would make it more sense that I think the way he got killed, people say he was unarmed, and then some people say he let him go. I think he let him go. Because I think they both knew people thinking Billy the Kid was dead was going to make him famous, and Billy the Kid, no one's going to ever look for him. He's dead. But it didn't. It backfired on Pat Garrett anyway. He ended up losing money. He was trying to run for some kind of office. He ended up losing. It all backfired on him anyway. He ended up being a drunk because it didn't work out for him the way he thought it was going to. He was a traitor. It doesn't matter. He still betrayed Billy Kid and his friends. So he'll always be remembered that way. Pat Garrett, you look at Pat Garrett, you go, who's Pat Garrett? Only some people know him that's hardcore fans of the movie or of Billy the Kid. That's another thing. It's like, who's Pat Garrett? The only people know he killed Billy the Kid, and most people don't really care about him. But you say who Billy the Kid is, everybody knows who he is. He was just this awesome maniac outlaw that everybody wanted to be. You will always remember that. That's how I'll remember Billy the Kid. And the Emilio Estevez movies just made it even him like a goddish figure. He made him like he's immortal. And I think that was awesome how they did those movies. So I'm going to give a shout out to all my people, my family, my friends, the people who follow us on ParaX, all the countries, everybody. I love you guys. I want you guys to know that we really try to do a good show every week. An action-packed hour for you guys. Sometimes it might get rambling because, some of this we're doing history. But we try to really do this because we love what we do. And this is always fun for me to do this for you guys. Like, this was something new with the Billy the Kid show. We got to do something different. And I enjoyed it. And I hope you guys did too. You remember to check us out on James Hershey's page on YouTube and subscribe so you can listen to all our shows. And remember, we have a Patreon page. So there's different prices and stuff. If you just want to pay for one time, there's different rewards. You could sponsor us. Or if you don't, we could do it another way. We have other ways of doing it. We don't just have the Patreon page. If you just want to sponsor us all together, just let us know. There's other ways we can deal with that. But check it out. You guys have a good night. Misfits, Sugar Ladies, and Monster Hunters, I love you, and blessed be. Have a good night, guys.
One thing that I always find interesting is how the childhood affects the adulthood. We saw this with Manson. We did a show on Charles Manson, I believe it was last week. It was very interesting to see how he became the maniac that we all love and hate. And with Billy, it was the same kind of thing. His early childhood formed him into the lovable killer that he became. And I think that's true with all of us. Our childhood shapes us. But it's very interesting to me to see that transformation take place over time as you follow the history of the person's life. And that's why when we do these shows on actual people, on historical events or historical people, that's why I take such care in providing you with a complete biography of the person. Many times with information that you've never heard before, even if you are a fan of the subject matter that we're doing. Because I try to get very, very in-depth in my research so that I have a complete understanding of the person by showtime. And Billy is an easy one for me because he's somebody that I've always been fascinated with. A lot of people probably don't know this about me, but I am a huge history buff. History is one of my passions in life. I love history. My favorite time periods in history are the Wild West is probably my all-time favorite. And I also love the medieval time period and like the Roman time period when the Roman Empire was huge. I really like those time periods. And the Old West is one of my favorite. And I would like to do a show someday on Jesse James, and I would really like to do a show on Tombstone and really break that down, the actual events that occurred that day, because they're different than what we all have come to know and understand through the movies. The actual events were a bit different. So maybe one day in the future we'll do those shows as well. We're going to do more history shows. We're also still going to be doing paranormal. That's going to be the majority of what we do is going to be our paranormal programming. But every once in a while, we're going to throw one of these history shows in for entertainment purposes, so you guys can learn some new stuff, and basically just for my own enjoyment, because I really do love doing the history stuff. So I want to thank you guys so much for listening. I want to thank you for all of your support and your love, your messages, all that kind of stuff. It's really cool, and I really, really appreciate it. Old Boy mentioned the Patreon page. Got different reward tiers set up there where you can go and pledge for the show to support it, and you get different things like shout outs on air and all that kind of stuff. If you're interested in that, go check that out. It's patreon.com/James Hershey Jr. The YouTube page is youtube.com/James Hershey Jr. It's completely free for you. I'll never charge you for the YouTube channel. It'll never be one of those things where you have to pay for videos or any of that crap. I'm always going to keep it free. So I hope you guys take advantage of that and enjoy it. Basically, just thanks, guys. Thanks a lot, because without your support, we couldn't be doing this. It means the world to us. It really does. That's all the time we have for this week. So until we speak to you again, love many, trust few, and do harm to none. We love you. Bye-bye.